The painting was hideous, which was probably why it had languished in the thrift store for weeks, with a price tag that kept dropping from $20 to $15 to finally $10. Marcus Rivera noticed it only because he was killing time on a Saturday afternoon, wandering through Goodwill with no particular goal beyond avoiding his empty apartment and the stack of medical bills sitting on his kitchen counter. The painting depicted a lighthouse in a storm, executed with the kind of amateur enthusiasm that suggested someone's well-intentioned hobby rather than actual artistic talent. The waves were the wrong color, the perspective was distorted, and the lighthouse itself leaned at an angle that defied both physics and aesthetics. But the frame was solid wood, substantial and well-made, worth more than $10 on its own, if Marcus decided to strip out the terrible painting and use the frame for something better. He was 32, recently laid off from his job as a graphic designer when the startup he'd worked for imploded spectacularly, and he'd been supplementing his dwindling savings by flipping thrift store finds online. Good frames sold reliably, and this one looked like it might be oak, heavy and professionally constructed. He carried it to the register, paid his $10, and drove home with the painting wedged in his back seat, already mentally listing it on eBay for $40 or $50 once he'd removed the canvas. His apartment was a studio in a building that had been nice 20 years ago, but was now just affordable, located in a neighborhood that real estate agents called transitional, which meant half the storefronts were vacant and the other half were check-cashing places and bodegas with security bars on the windows. Marcus had been living there for 3 years, longer than he'd intended, trapped by a combination of student loan debt and the reality that graphic design jobs in his city paid less than survival required. The layoff had been devastating, but not surprising. The startup had been hemorrhaging money for months, and Marcus had seen the writing on the wall, even as his bosses insisted everything was fine. Now he was 2 months behind on rent, facing eviction, applying to jobs that either didn't respond or offered wages that wouldn't cover his basic expenses. The painting sat against his wall for 2 days before he got around to removing it from the frame, his motivation sapped by the grinding anxiety of unemployment and debt. Before we reveal what Marcus found behind that terrible painting and how it transformed his desperate situation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss how this story unfolds. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers around the world who appreciate stories about how sometimes the things we overlook contain exactly what we need. There's something both humbling and enraging about being talented and educated and still broke, about having skills that should translate into stable income, but that the market has decided aren't valuable enough to pay for adequately. Marcus had graduated with a design degree from a good school, had built a portfolio he was proud of, had done everything right according to the formula he'd been taught, and yet here he was at 32, unemployed and facing eviction, buying $10 paintings at thrift stores, hoping to resell the frames for enough profit to buy groceries. His parents had sacrificed to help pay for his education, immigrants who'd worked service jobs and believed fiercely in the promise that education led to opportunity, and Marcus felt the weight of their disappointment even though they'd never expressed it directly. They'd expected him to achieve stability, to build the kind of middle-class life they'd never accessed themselves, and instead he was living in a studio apartment he couldn't afford, eating ramen because meat was too expensive, avoiding their phone calls because he couldn't stand to tell them how badly things were going. The irony was that he was good at design, had genuine talent and strong technical skills, but the industry had changed in ways that made individual talent less valuable than it had been. Clients wanted cheap and fast. Companies wanted designers who'd work for startup equity instead of actual salaries. And the market was flooded with people willing to accept terrible terms because they were as desperate as Marcus, or because they had family money that let them treat creative work as something other than survival. Marcus had been applying to jobs for 2 months with minimal response, had lowered his salary requirements to the point where accepting an offer would mean working full-time and still needing a second job to cover rent, had started to realize that maybe the promised formula of education leading to stable employment had been a lie, or at least a promise that expired before he'd had a chance to benefit from it. He finally got around to working on the frame on a Wednesday evening, using a flathead screwdriver to carefully pry the backing away from the wood without damaging the frame itself. The backing was held in place by small nails that had been there long enough to leave rust stains, but that came free relatively easily with pressure. Marcus worked methodically, removing each nail and setting it aside until the backing lifted away and he could slide the terrible lighthouse painting out of the frame. Something else came out with it. A second canvas, roughly the same size as the lighthouse that had been hidden behind the first painting, pressed flat against the backing. Marcus set the lighthouse aside and examined what he'd found, his hands suddenly unsteady as he realized he was looking at something significantly more accomplished than amateur storm scenes. The hidden painting was a portrait, oil on canvas, depicting a young woman in clothing that looked early 20th century based on the style and cut. The technique was professional, confident brushwork and sophisticated color mixing, the kind of painting that belonged in a museum or gallery rather than hidden behind trash art in a thrift store frame. The woman's face was rendered with particular care, her expression enigmatic and slightly sad, her eyes following the viewer with that uncanny quality that marks skilled portraiture. Marcus turned the canvas over, looking for a signature or date, and found both. Eleanor Hartley, 1924, written in faded ink in the upper right corner, and below that, a signature he didn't immediately recognize but that looked European, possibly German, based on the styling of the letters. He pulled out his phone and photographed the signature, then ran it through an image search, hands shaking slightly as he waited for results. What came back made him sit down hard on his apartment floor, phone clutched in both hands, staring at the name that appeared across multiple museum websites and auction house records. Wilhelm Hartmann, German portrait painter, 1880–1943. Known for his society portraits in the 1920s, works currently valued between $50,000 and $200,000, depending on subject and provenance. Marcus's first instinct was disbelief, certainty that this had to be a reproduction or a student copy, that it couldn't possibly be an actual Hartmann painting hidden behind a $10 thrift store lighthouse. But as he researched more, comparing the signature to verified examples, examining the canvas and paint with the limited tools he had available, the possibility shifted from impossible to unlikely to potentially real. The painting style matched Hartmann's known work from the 1920s. The signature appeared genuine, and the physical characteristics of the canvas and frame suggested appropriate age. He found references to Eleanor Hartley in his research. She'd been an American heiress who'd spent time in Europe in the 1920s, had been painted by several prominent artists of the era, and had died in 1962 without children, her estate dispersed through various sales and donations. One article mentioned that several of her commissioned portraits had been sold at auction in the 1960s and 70s, but that the locations of some paintings had been lost to history, their current whereabouts unknown. Marcus spent the next 3 hours researching obsessively, cross-referencing information about Hartmann, about Eleanor Hartley, about the art market and authentication processes. If this was real, if he'd accidentally bought an authentic Wilhelm Hartmann portrait for $10 at Goodwill, then he was holding something worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough to solve every financial problem he faced and then some. But authentication was crucial. Without proper provenance and expert verification, the painting was just a beautiful object with no market value. He needed to get it authenticated, needed to have experts examine it and confirm what he suspected, but he also needed to be careful about how he did that, needed to protect himself legally and make sure he actually owned what he'd found. He researched authentication services, finding that major auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's offered authentication for paintings like this, but that the process could take weeks and required detailed documentation. He also found references to a local art appraiser who specialized in European paintings and who might be able to provide a preliminary assessment before Marcus invested time and money in full authentication. The appraiser's name was Dr. Catherine Wells, and her office was located in the Arts District downtown, in a building that housed several galleries and artist studios. Marcus called the next morning and explained vaguely that he had a painting he needed assessed, was given an appointment for the following day, and spent the intervening time carefully packaging the portrait and researching everything he could find about authentication processes and art market sales. He barely slept that night, mind racing between wild optimism about what the painting might be worth and crushing pessimism about the likelihood that it was just a very good reproduction. The appointment was at 2 in the afternoon, and Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, the wrapped painting under his arm, feeling simultaneously hopeful and ridiculous. Dr. Wells was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back severely and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of fake and misattribution that desperate people could present to her. Marcus unwrapped the painting and explained how he'd found it, watching her face for reaction as she examined first the front, then the signature, then the canvas itself with a jeweler's loupe. Her expression shifted from professional skepticism to focused interest, and she asked permission to take several photographs and to examine the painting under ultraviolet light. Marcus agreed, his heart hammering as he watched her work methodically through what was clearly a standard authentication process. After 20 minutes, Dr. Wells sat back and looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise and what might have been envy. She said that pending full forensic analysis, chemical testing of the pigments, and consultation with specialists in Hartmann's work, her preliminary assessment was that this appeared to be an authentic Wilhelm Hartmann portrait from approximately 1924. The signature matched verified examples. The technique was consistent with Hartmann's known style from that period. The aging of the canvas and paint appeared appropriate, and the subject matched the description of a portrait of Eleanor Hartley that had been listed as missing in several art history catalogues. If authentication confirmed what Dr. Wells suspected, Marcus was looking at a painting worth somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000, depending on condition and market factors. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe, like the room had tilted sideways and he was falling, even though he was sitting still. Dr. Wells was talking about next steps, about formal authentication services, about contacting auction houses and establishing provenance, but Marcus could barely process the information through the roaring in his ears. $150,000 minimum, potentially $300,000. All from a $10 thrift store painting he'd bought, intending to strip out the canvas and sell the frame. Dr. Wells noticed his reaction and smiled slightly, said she'd seen this before, people who'd stumbled onto valuable art through luck or accident, and that while it was exciting, it was also important to be methodical about authentication and sale. She provided contact information for authentication services, recommended a lawyer who specialized in art sales, and strongly suggested that Marcus not tell anyone else about the painting until ownership and value were firmly established. She also asked, delicately, whether Marcus had any documentation about where he'd purchased the painting, whether he had a receipt, or any way to prove he was the legal owner. Marcus showed her the credit card receipt from Goodwill, $10 for decorative art, which Dr. Wells said should be sufficient to establish his ownership since he'd purchased it legitimately from a store that had the right to sell donated items. She explained that thrift stores typically acquired ownership of donated items automatically unless donors specifically restricted sale or asked for items to be returned unsold, which clearly hadn't happened with this painting, given that it had been on the floor for weeks with a declining price. Marcus left her office with the painting carefully wrapped and a folder full of information about authentication services and art lawyers, his mind spinning with possibilities he'd barely dared to imagine when he'd woken up that morning. He went home and sat in his apartment staring at the portrait, at Eleanor Hartley's enigmatic expression, wondering how this painting had ended up hidden behind amateur artwork, how it had traveled from a wealthy woman's estate sale in the 1960s to a thrift store in his city in 2024, how many people had owned it and moved it and finally donated it without ever looking behind the terrible lighthouse to see what was hidden there. The authentication process took 6 weeks and cost $3,000 that Marcus had to borrow from his parents, explaining only that he had a potential asset that needed professional verification before he could sell it. His parents were confused, but agreed to loan him the money, probably assuming he'd found something valuable at an estate sale and was trying to flip it for profit. The authentication involved chemical analysis of the paint, examination of the canvas weaving patterns, comparison of the signature to verified examples, research into the provenance and history of the painting, and consultation with 2 experts on Hartman's work. Marcus spent those 6 weeks in a state of suspended anxiety, afraid to hope but unable to stop hoping, alternating between checking his email obsessively and forcing himself not to think about the painting at all. He continued applying for jobs, continued trying to negotiate with his landlord about back rent, continued living on the edge of financial disaster while potentially owning an object worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The final authentication report arrived via email on a Tuesday morning, a 30-page document that Marcus couldn't bring himself to open for 10 minutes, afraid of what it might say. When he finally opened it, the conclusion was unequivocal. The painting was an authentic Wilhelm Hartmann portrait, painted in 1924, depicting Eleanor Hartley, with provenance traced back to her estate sale in 1963. The painting had been purchased at that sale by a collector in Chicago, had passed through 2 more private sales in the 1970s and 80s, and had apparently been acquired by someone in Marcus's city in the 1990s, based on ownership records the authenticators had tracked down. At some point, likely after the last documented owner's death, the painting had been donated to Goodwill, possibly by family members clearing out an estate who hadn't realized what they were giving away, or possibly had been stored behind the lighthouse painting deliberately, and the person who donated it had only meant to donate the visible artwork. The authentication report noted that the painting was in excellent condition, that it was a particularly fine example of Hartmann's portraiture, and that based on recent auction results for comparable works, the estimated value was between $200,000 and $350,000. Marcus contacted the art lawyer Dr. Wells had recommended, a woman named Jennifer Torres, who specialized in helping people navigate the sale of valuable art. She reviewed his documentation, confirmed that he had clear legal ownership of the painting, and recommended that he consign it to either Sotheby's or Christie's for auction rather than trying to sell it privately. She explained that auction houses would handle marketing, would attract serious buyers, and would likely achieve a better price than he could negotiate on his own. She also explained the fees involved. Auction houses typically charged a seller's commission of around 10%, plus there were insurance costs, marketing fees, and various other expenses that would reduce what Marcus actually received. Even accounting for all those costs, and for the money he'd borrowed for authentication, and for taxes on the sale, Marcus was looking at walking away with somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000. Jennifer helped him prepare the consignment agreement, negotiated terms with Christie's that were slightly more favorable than their standard contract, and handled all the legal details while Marcus tried to process that his life was about to change completely. The painting was scheduled for auction in Christie's spring sale of European art, which meant a 3-month wait before the actual sale. But Christie's advanced Marcus $25,000 against the expected sale price, a standard practice that let sellers access funds before auction while ensuring they remained committed to selling through Christie's. That $25,000 was enough for Marcus to pay his back rent, to pay his parents back for the authentication costs, to buy groceries without calculating cost to the dollar, to stop the immediate financial hemorrhaging that had been consuming his life for months. He continued applying for jobs because he knew the auction proceeds, even if everything went well, wouldn't last forever, that he'd need income eventually. But the desperate urgency was gone, replaced by the knowledge that he had a cushion, that he wasn't one bad month away from homelessness, that he'd accidentally stumbled into enough money to fundamentally change his circumstances. The auction took place on a Tuesday evening in April, conducted both in Christie's physical sales room in New York and online for remote bidders. Marcus attended virtually, watching the live stream from his apartment, his heart hammering as the lot number for his painting appeared on screen. The auctioneer opened bidding at $100,000, and within 90 seconds the price had climbed to $200,000, then $250,000, then $300,000. Marcus watched in disbelief as 2 bidders competed for his painting, driving the price higher in $10,000 increments, finally ending at $320,000, far exceeding the high estimate. After commissions and fees, Marcus would receive approximately $275,000, more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to transform his life in ways he was still trying to comprehend. The money arrived in his account 2 weeks after the auction, and Marcus spent several days just staring at his bank balance, unable to believe the numbers were real. He paid off his student loans entirely, eliminating the monthly payments that had been consuming 1/3 of his income. He paid off his credit card debt, the accumulation of years of making rent by putting groceries and utilities on plastic. He put $50,000 in a savings account for emergencies, a cushion against future disasters. He prepaid 6 months of rent on his apartment, buying himself time to make decisions about what came next without the immediate pressure of monthly payments. And then he had to figure out what to do with the rest, how to use this windfall in ways that created lasting benefit rather than just extending his runway until the money ran out. He'd been thinking about this since the authentication came back positive, had been researching options and talking to a financial advisor Jennifer Torres had recommended. He decided to invest the majority of what remained, conservative index funds that would grow slowly but steadily, creating a foundation that could support him long-term. He also decided to use some of it to restart his career on terms that actually worked, to stop accepting terrible freelance rates and instead build the kind of design practice he'd always wanted but couldn't afford to pursue when he was desperate for any paying work. Marcus quit applying to jobs and instead started his own design studio, using $20,000 to fund the first year of operations, to build a proper website and portfolio, to market himself to the kinds of clients who valued good design enough to pay for it properly. He rented a small office space in the Arts District near Dr. Wells's appraisal office, a single room with good light and enough space for his equipment. He reached out to former colleagues and clients, let them know he was available for projects, and within 2 months had enough work to support himself without touching the invested portion of his auction proceeds. The work was better than what he'd been doing at the startup. Clients who had real budgets and appreciated quality, projects that challenged him creatively rather than just asking for cheap and fast. He found himself enjoying design again, rediscovering the passion that had led him to study it in the first place, the satisfaction of solving visual problems and creating work he was proud of. His parents were amazed when he finally told them the full story about the $10 painting and what had been hidden behind it, about the authentication and the auction and the money that had solved all his immediate problems and created possibilities for the future. His mother cried, overwhelmed by relief that her son was okay, that the education they'd sacrificed for had led to something good, even if indirectly, even if through luck, rather than the direct path they'd expected. His father wanted to know every detail, wanted to understand how a painting worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had ended up in Goodwill, wanted to calculate the probability of finding something like that, wanted to quantify the luck involved. Marcus tried to explain that he didn't know, that the provenance research had taken the painting's history back to the 1990s, but couldn't determine exactly how it ended up donated, that probably someone had died and their family had cleaned out their house and donated boxes of items without examining them carefully, that his $10 purchase had been the intersection of someone else's carelessness and his own decision to buy a painting he'd thought was worthless, but that had a decent frame. He thought about that intersection often, about how many small choices had led to this outcome. If the painting had been priced at $20 instead of $10, he might not have bought it. If someone at Goodwill had examined donations more carefully, they might have discovered the hidden portrait. If Marcus had decided to sell the frame online without bothering to remove the canvas first, he'd never have found what was behind it. If he'd gone to Goodwill on a different day, or if someone else had bought the painting before he saw it, his life would still be the desperate struggle it had been before. Luck, chance, timing, all of it had aligned in ways that felt almost too convenient to believe, and yet it had happened, was still happening, as Marcus built a new version of his life on the foundation that one lucky find had created. He kept the terrible lighthouse painting, the amateur storm scene that had hidden Eleanor Hartley's portrait for decades. He hung it in his office, a reminder that value wasn't always visible, that sometimes the things that looked worthless contained exactly what you needed, that desperation and luck could intersect in unexpected ways. Clients would ask about it, would comment on the questionable artistic merit, and Marcus would smile and say it was a reminder to look deeper, to not judge by surfaces, to pay attention to what might be hidden behind the obvious. He never told the full story to clients, kept it mostly private, except with close friends and family, partially because it felt too personal to share casually, and partially because he didn't want to be known primarily as the guy who got lucky, rather than as someone who did good work. The painting had changed his life, but he wanted his life to be defined by what he built with that change, rather than just by the luck of finding it. He dated the woman who'd authenticated the painting, Dr. Wells's assistant, who'd done much of the research work, and who Marcus had gotten to know during the authentication process. Her name was Sophie. She was an art historian working on her PhD, and she found Marcus's story charming rather than just lucky. They'd been seeing each other for 3 months when the auction happened, and she'd watched the live stream with him, had held his hand as the bidding climbed higher than expected, had celebrated with him when the final price came in. She understood the art world in ways Marcus didn't, understood the market forces and collector psychology that had driven 2 bidders to compete for his painting, understood how rare it was to find something like this, but also how often valuable art circulated through informal channels because people didn't know what they had. A year after buying the painting, Marcus's life bore almost no resemblance to where he'd been. He had a successful design studio, a comfortable savings cushion, a relationship with someone who understood and supported his work, and a future that felt full of possibility rather than just strategies for avoiding disaster. He still shopped at thrift stores occasionally, still looked through dusty paintings and overlooked frames, though now it was more about nostalgia than necessity, more about remembering where he'd been than actually needing to flip frames for grocery money. He never found another hidden masterpiece, but he didn't expect to. That kind of luck happened once if you were fortunate, and Marcus had already had his moment. What he'd found behind that $10 painting had changed his life, not just because of the money, but because of what the money had allowed him to build, the space it had created for him to pursue work he cared about rather than just work that paid immediately, the foundation it had provided for constructing the life he'd wanted but hadn't been able to access through conventional paths. He'd bought a terrible painting for $10, hoping to resell a frame for $40. And instead he'd found something worth hundreds of thousands, something that had been hiding in plain sight behind amateur brushstrokes and questionable perspective, waiting for someone to look deeper, to remove the obvious layer and discover what had been preserved beneath it. The painting had been hidden, and so had its value, and uncovering both had required nothing more than basic curiosity and the willingness to take apart what appeared complete. Sometimes that was all it took, the willingness to look behind surfaces, to investigate what seemed settled, to wonder if there might be more than what was immediately visible. Marcus had wondered, had looked, had found, and his life had changed because of that simple sequence of actions. The painting was hanging in a collector's home now, Eleanor Hartley's portrait finally displayed after decades of hiding, her enigmatic expression visible again to people who could appreciate both the artistry and the history. And Marcus was building his life in his small office in the Arts District, designing work he was proud of, dating someone who made him happy, financially stable in ways he'd once thought impossible, all because he'd spent $10 on a terrible painting and had bothered to look at what was behind it. That, he'd learned, was how lives changed. Not through grand plans or perfect execution, but through small choices that intersected with luck, through curiosity that revealed hidden value, through the willingness to look deeper when everything suggested you'd already seen all there was to see.